Dear viewers, I would like to welcome you again to our series Visite. And at this point, thank you very much for all your letters, from which I've chosen a topic today of diagnostics. In the meantime, word has gotten around that, of course, I attach great importance to good intestinal diagnostics, and I received an inquiry from Martina S. from Darmstadt. She's 55 years old and reports that she has had digestive problems for many years. They include an incredible amount of bloating, gas in the abdomen, sometimes very soft stools. And she can never really rely on her gut. The colonoscopy brought no results, quite the opposite. Everything was fine, but a polyp had been removed. She can now deal with this information badly, since she realises that it is a major weak point in her body, and she asked me for advice how to diagnose leaky gut syndrome. Leaky gut is permeability, like a pot that drips. And to identify this, leaky gut syndrome means that you first have to think about who is our intestine anyway. It's not just an organ which digests food and nutrition and thus provides the nutrients that the body absorbs, but the intestine forms the short-chain fatty acids via its bacteria, and the intestine also produces a large part for our vitamins. The intestine breaks down foreign substances, especially toxic substances. The gut stimulates the mucosa's membrane immune system. Here in our intestinal mucosa lies 80% of our immunity. The intestine naturally also displaces pathogens by having its healthy microflora, and these are millions of high-quality microorganisms which watch over an intestinal flora that is very sophisticated within the framework of its composition, and also ensures that pathological germs do not multiply, but that everything is always in a healthy balance. We have known for a long time that if the root of the human plant is not in balance, that it comes to the so-called irritable bowel syndrome, a term I never really use. What is irritable bowel? This can be an inflammation, a permeability syndrome, a chronic inflammation in the form of colitis. It can be parasites, fungi, bacteria. These can be toxic loads that repeatedly provoke irritation of the mucous membrane. The intestine is the result of insufficient digestive power and sufficient bile, or also gastric juice, including pancreatic juices. So irritation syndrome is a big word, but that can't be enough. Of course, you have to verify it. Then, of course, immunological processes can develop from a lack of intact bowel function. Autoimmune processes, and we already have well over 100 of them today, autoimmune diseases, all start in the gut. And how often is this area in our body simply hidden? And we hardly have any other possibility but to get a very superficial look with the examiner's naked eye, in my opinion. Is this intestinal mucosa intact or not? It is interesting that you wrote that a polyp was removed. A polyp is formed in the intestinal microbiota. It's a protuberance. When the gut is in a position to encapsulate something. And today we know that behind it are chronic inflammatory processes, which are, in long term, assessed medically as precursor to adenocarcinoma. That's why you always say after a colonoscopy, have a follow-up in a year and maybe not in 3 years. But you don't really do anything. And if you have a polyp, it should be very important to get to the bottom of things here. Chronic inflammatory diseases, of course, which continue to build up on a non-intact mucosa. Food intolerance, histamine intolerance, but also neurological disorders, the development of Parkinson's, the development of mental behaviour patterns. There is no autistic child who has a healthy gut. That's where everything often begins. And that's why the disruption of these things, also through antibiotics, therapies, which are directed against life, is of a crucial importance to make a statement here. And now, as part of the explanation, I would like to show you a picture of an intestinal mucosa. And there you see, if there is an intact mucous membrane, then it has a very balanced and coordinated bacterial flora, which does its job with immense power here. The deeper the layers go, there are the so-called tight junctions that are protein molecules that really filter like a grid. Because everything that is allowed into the body, and you see the blood vessels run down there, everything is checked several times through this temporary barrier until it even reaches the intestine or reaches the blood. Only the good things are allowed to enter here, the less good things are rejected. But it can occur that the intestinal mucosa develops a chronic latent inflammation, and we call this silent inflammation. And the intestine has an area of about 300 to 400 square metres. Then there really are holes in that barrier. You can see in the picture on the right that as part of these tight junctions, these sieves are significantly enlarged. Chronic inflammation always has a tendency to destroy, while acute inflammation is classified as part of a repair process. And this chronic inflammation is actually what causes this leak. And if that leak is there, then there is now at the level of the body, namely in the blood, there is now the toxin load. We also say lipopolysaccharide endotoxins, which are fragments of bacteria, parasite material, whereupon the immune system now has to ring all the bells in the organism in order to destroy invaders in the blood, of course. For this purpose, the immune system is started, and which, of course, is the utmost duty, and which is, of course, the utmost and most pressing importance, that such a leak, that such an infection is recognised by the mucosa. You can't see that when you look inside. The examiner's naked eye can certainly see a highly inflammatory area. Recognise a swollen mucosa in ulcerative colitis. That's out of the question. But what presents itself on a level that we're unable to perceive with the naked eye does not mean that these intracellular openings aren't problematic to the individual in the long term. So there are many, many changes on the side of the intestine, which of course now lead to that crucial and an important prerequisite is that the microflora is intact. This is the first barrier. And this first barrier is also called a colonization resistance, which is there to actually regulate the whole nutrient uptake. The other thing is that the intestine is embedded with a so-called mucosal mucus, and this mucosal mucus serves as a protection and transport function, of course, but also to release these immunoglobulins, this secretory IgA, which is constantly present in the antigen binding. Everything that comes into direct contact with the mucous membrane must, of course, be rejected by the body or by the mucous membrane, must not pass through the mucous membrane and enter the body in the pathological form. And you can use a stool sample to determine the mucosal immunity via the so-called secretory IgA. Is this imbalance, or is the mucous membrane severely overregulated due to its inflammatory nature? If the so-called secretory IgA is very high, much higher than normal is from 500 to 2000, if it's around 3000, then you know that this immune barrier is in a permanent tireless reaction to repel antigens. Of course, the next step in the diagnostics must be to fathom this even more specifically and more deeply. Who is constantly responsible for this attack on the mucous membrane? And then, of course, there is this intestinal diffusion layer, which you can also see in the picture on the right. That means these tight junctions, this tight protein network, which of course also opens up as a result of the inflammation, and thus, of course, there is an uncontrolled permeability, and it is responsible for the development of type 1 diabetes, multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, and so on. Causes of these things can be in the context of this intestinal epithelial layer that we eat too much grain. Grains containing gluten. Gluten causes these quiet inflammations in the intestine after 4 to 70 hours. And these things are, of course, incredibly important. This is also a parasitic load that should be looked into. Please make sure to have your children checked for roundworms from time to time. In 4 to 7-year-olds, 90% of children are affected by roundworms. This has to do with the fact that they are uncontrollably close to life. They put their fingers in their mouths and, of course, put a strain on the intestines. There is a lot of physical stress and mental stress that affects blood flow and microcirculation disturbance on the intestinal mucosa. Stress creates tension. This can lead to chronic inflammation, but at the same time it means too many stress hormones which are formed so that the intestinal mucosa swells. When we devote ourselves more to the stress in life, on the other hand, we of course reduce the peristalsis and the intestine becomes constipated, it becomes clogged. It no longer has peristaltic power, but that's because of the stress. And all this within the framework of multi-causal conditions ultimately creates an intestine that goes into a so-called increased permeability. I want to show you another picture. So if you do an investigation of your intestines to get these things checked, then contact a laboratory that is very specialised in complementary medicine. In Germany, for example, this is in Gansimum Laboratory in Mainz, or the Biovis Laboratory for Me Too laboratories that I know very well. And if you want to determine the secretory IgA, to know how is my mucosal immunity, this is incredibly important because the mucous membranes are our first point of contact. I must say the information about the quality of the mucous membrane of the gut tells me how is the mucous membrane of my eyes, how is the mucous membrane in my nose, how is the mucous membrane in my esophagus. And there's a lot I can do to turn that mucosa back into an active, strong and defence-oriented Function. This is the so-called secretory IgA, which can be determined by a stool sample alone. This is also an important point in diagnostics. The second point is that you have to analyse the flammability, of course, and you can do that with calprotectin. This is a parameter which, when the value is increased, indicates an invasive inflammation. And very often food allergies hide in the background. Oh, also, of course, the histamine. Histamine is a biogenic amine, an endogenous product, but is also formed very strongly by histamine-producing bacteria. When a missing or putrefactive flora occurs, that is, the good and healthy bacteria in the intestines, which consists of 80% lactic acid bacteria, such as bifidus bacteria, lactobacilli, or enterococci. If this flora is simply too weak, and thus the pH value changes, standard value ID 5 to 6.5, then this milieu tends towards a basic one, and thus other germs have an advantage. It is very important that the pH in the colon is between 5.5 and 6.5. It is different in the small intestine. There it is 8.5, and the stomach very acidic 1.4. But this milieu is attuned to it, and if there are changes in the milieu, consequence are that, of course, other bacteria then feel more comfortable or less comfortable. They are also determined to a certain extent by this pH regulation. It's the same as in the mouth. When the pH is between 5 and 6 and it's going down, acidic, then, of course, enough of the carbohydrate-consuming bacteria, highly toxic acids, are formed. That could be difficult when the pH value is in a better equilibrium, or if, of course, the carbohydrate load is reduced. This is the so-called calprotectin, and here too just a stool sample is sufficient. You can, of course, also determine these values together. Zonulin is also a very nice parameter for the regulation of the mucous membrane. Determining zonula in the blood is very sensitive and not the best parameter in my opinion. But it is very good in the stool. And if you've increased your zonulin level, then you know here's a mucosal permeability present, and the alpha antitrypsin too is as a parameter that shows that the intestinal mucosa is subject to inflammation and can help us in therapy, which then follows, of course, to be an important parameter. A stool exam is optimal for the diagnosis of this leaky gut syndrome, or in search of inflammation with these 4 values. Whenever you want to have a bigger statement about the microbiome and the bioactive, also necessary information about the intestinal mucosa, about the microenvironment of the bacteria, also about the possibility, how do I digest? Are there any digestive residues? Carbohydrate digestion, protein digestion, fat digestion. This is also very important information because, of course, you also know indirectly whether the pancreas is intact. Does my body manage to make enough bile? These are very important statements that can also be determined using a stool sample. Also, how does the pancreas work? There's a very interesting enzyme, and that's elastase. And if the elastase is not there enough, then I always have an incredible amount of flatulence because the metabolism of fat and protein produces scatol, hydrogen sulfide, which of course has a detrimental effect on the microenvironment. But perhaps it is very important to recognise such things, not just to support the pancreas now, but to change something at the cause. And that usually starts with what we eat, what we consume, how we live, how much stress we have. These are examinations when you request laboratory diagnostics as a person. In my opinion, one of the most important investments you can make for your own health. For me, a colonoscopy is not on the same level at all. We would do well if we did this investigation sooner for our people, and it would be important to us also from the insurance side. But until that's the case, I would think it's really, really, really important for everyone to have a stool test like this once a year, because you can see an incredible number of processes in advance. You can change them. Sometimes people don't come with intestinal problems, but they may have rheumatism or recurring joint problems, or they have a migraine, or they have other health problems. But to understand illness as a process, also to understand illness as a process that the body wants to signal somewhere that it needs help, can be significantly fruitful here in the context of this diagnosis. And I want to end here too. And it was important to give you this information because these things you can take into your own hands. And perhaps with this increased knowledge, you don't sit back and say, my colonoscopy is fine. What we can say with certainty is that we have not found any tumours. That too is often very reassuring if you are concerned. But I have to tell you one thing. No colon carcinoma can develop on a healthy mucosa. This always requires latent chronic inflammation and sometimes silent inflammation. And we can recognise this process beforehand and then deal with this topic in the future so that we no longer have to deal with it at all. But health is not a gift. Health is a daily task. And that is why caring for us is not only necessary today, but actually every day in a healthy balance. But that was very important to me to give you now as a recommendation. And with this in mind, I wish you all a wonderful week. And I look forward to your comments and questions, and I'm really looking forward to the next show, and have a nice week. Thanks. Goodbye.